But let me say something, I mean, to begin with about, just the challenge of foreign assistance, in the American government over the last 10 or 12 years. So if you look at the United States has always been a relatively, in terms of percentage of GDP, the United States has always been a relatively low foreign aid donor. If you looked at the period, if you looked at the 1990s at the end of the Cold War, American foreign assistance went down to something like 0.12 or 0.15 of GDP. So it dropped significantly from the period during the Cold War, and then it increased very substantially under Bush, and is more or less held up at the same levels during the Obama administration. But what I can say is, if you think, thinking about foreign aid and the priority that foreign assistance had, for the Bush administration as opposed to the Obama administration, 9/11 obviously was a defining moment for the Bush administration. And if you look at the national security strategy in 2002, I was working at the National Security Council then, and was kind of not directly involved, but somewhat peripherally involved with the 2002 national security strategy. I do think what you saw in the Bush administration was an effort to actually develop something that looked like a grand strategy for American foreign policy. So the Bush administration looked at the attacks of 9/11, identified those attacks with repressive political regimes, primarily in the Middle East, and argued that a core objective of American national security had to be to somehow transform these regimes into democratic regimes. I think that was a belief and a view that was deeply held by the president and by some, not all, but some other members of the Bush administration. And you actually saw a focus on foreign aid in the Bush administration, which had been absent for the previous decade. I think for Obama, it's different. I mean, you were now 8 years later. It's clear that many of the efforts of the Bush administration had not exactly been roaring successes. It was very uncertain, what the appropriate policies for the United States were. And I think you had actually a much more modest set of goals under the Obama administration than you did under the Bush administration in terms of what you could actually do with foreign assistance. And I think also less focus than there was during the Bush administration. But I thought what I try to do is I'm very happy to come back, talk especially about my experience. But I thought it would be most productive to actually spend this first session in the morning talking about foreign assistance, the history of foreign assistance, how it evolved, how effective it's been, what its problems are, what we actually know about what works in foreign assistance, which is actually not necessarily that much. And then we can kind of, many of you have had certainly more experience with foreign assistance on the receiving end than I have. And I've had a little bit of experience in kind of the formulating and the framing end. So, first of all, I think the striking thing about foreign assistance and something to recognize you can all hear me, right? Yes. Yeah. I mean, just at the outset is that, look, it's a pretty strange thing. So the idea of foreign assistance is that richer countries will give poorer countries money for the economic development of these poorer countries. Not necessarily with strategic or other kinds of objectives in mind. But it's good that there's a great deal of foreign aid that's been related to strategic objectives or humanitarian concerns and not to economic development writ large. But still, this is a strange thing in human history. If you look back to international capital flows at any time before 1945, they were strategic or economic. So these are some examples before the First World War. Basically, the countries that had capital were primarily Britain and France. They opened access to their capital markets in a selective way. And the objective of opening capital markets in a selective way was to cement their security alliances. So Germany loans money to the Ottoman Empire to develop railroads before the First World War because Germany wants an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. When relations between France and Russia warmed during the 1890s, France opens its capital markets to Russia, whereas before that they had been closed. When the British signed an agreement with the Russians in 1907, kind of dividing up Central Asia, Britain opens its capital markets to Russia in a way that had not been true before. But the idea that you would have used capital flows simply to assist or even to rationalize your behavior in this way, and to say that you would have used capital flows simply to increase the economic well-being in some other state, that was completely off the table. Whereas if you look at international rhetoric now, I don't want to say I understand how deeply people believe it, but international rhetoric, if you listen, for instance, to refugees from Syria, they will say things like, we have been abandoned by the international community. The international community has an obligation to help us in some way. This is a language that 100 years ago would have been incomprehensible. I mean, just people wouldn't have understood it at all. So it's first of all to recognize that we're operating in this world where there's some sense that the richer countries have some obligations to provide foreign assistance to poor countries. That's not something that had existed before 1945, and in a way, it's kind of strange. It's not obvious why that would be the case. All right, so foreign assistance then begins after the Second World War, and the question is why? Why does this happen? And I think there are really two fundamental drivers, I mean, both of which are associated with the interwar years and the experience of the Second World War and Nazi Germany. So one is that there's a general recognition that the Great Depression in the 1930s was a big driver of the Second World War. And that economic retrenchment, economic failure was something that had contributed to the war and to the rise of Nazi Germany. So that's one kind of universal kind of recognition, at least in the industrialized West. The second, and this is especially true, I mean, for the Americans and the Europeans, was a sense on the part of the United States that it was very important to rebuild Europe economically. And that without that, you were likely to have war, and conflict, which the United States would be dragged into. So this was certainly a security concern of the United States, not just a kind of a general concern about well-being in target states. There was also for the United States, and this though came later in 1948 and not really in 1945, a concern with communism, the rise of communism and the spread of communism in Western Europe especially. So the communists almost won elections in France and Italy in 1948. The Americans were very uncertain in 1945 about exactly what the position and relations with the Soviet Union were going to be immediately after the war. Despite that, you do have the creation of the World Bank at Bretton Woods and the International Monetary Fund. So you create these international organizations which are somewhat out of the control of national governments, which is itself also a striking development. You know, it's true the United States had most of the votes, a plurality of votes in the bank and the fund, and had a big influence over bank and fund policies. But the idea that you would have created an international organization where power was shared, rather than continuing with simply bilateral relations, was also a striking and different development. So by 1948, though, I mean, which is after the creation of the fund and the bank, you do have in both in the United States this recognition that you will have the Cold War, you will have conflict with the Soviet Union, that the triumph of communism in Western Europe was going to be partly dependent on economic conditions, and the United States was very concerned with promoting European economic development, and did this more through bilateral means, the Marshall Plan, than through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But this is really a kind of shift in mentality, that general economic conditions in other countries could affect your security. that you would give money to other countries not just to cement a political alliance or a security alliance, but you would give money to other countries because you needed to improve their economic conditions more generally. So if you look at foreign aid, I think you can trace the beginning of foreign aid to this set of developments after the Second World War. This has certainly become a deeply, deeply embedded practice in the international environment. So the idea now that any advanced industrialized country would stop giving foreign aid, I think that's basically unthinkable. Even though if you look at the, as we'll say as we move along, if you look at the empirical record for foreign assistance, it's pretty messy. I mean, it's very hard to say that this big enterprise has really been a success. It's been a success in some areas, but not in other areas. Despite that, the idea that people would stop giving foreign aid is like unthinkable. So this is sort of really a change in the normative way in which countries think about, in general, the international community thinks about practices that are acceptable practices in the international system. So if a country like South Korea, for instance, which is a newly rich country, a relatively new member of the OECD, gives a relatively small percentage of its GDP as foreign aid, about 0.22%, I think. But the idea that Korea would say, you know, this is ridiculous. You guys have been giving foreign aid for 50 years. It basically hasn't done any good. We're not going to spend our money on that. You absolutely could not do that. And in fact, Korea, you know, is really taking an opposite stance, which is that we want to be a respectable member of the international community. We're going to be a donor country. They're not giving a lot of money, but they're certainly giving some money. And they're absolutely not saying, forget about it. We're not going to do this at all because we don't think this is something that works. But having said that, there's a lot of variation across the advanced industrialized countries in terms of their commitment to foreign aid. There is a target figure of 0.7% of GDP, which has been accepted as a target that countries should aspire to, donor countries should aspire to since the early 1970s. This figure of 0.7% was actually derived out of thin air. It was derived from a theory which nobody believes in anymore at all. So the argument came from the following. At the beginning, sort of in the early days of foreign aid, the 1950s and 1960s, the general view was that the problem for developing countries was that they did not have enough capital. And if you wanted to reach, for instance, a target rate of growth of 3%, if you use the formula that was generally available, to reach there would have been a financing gap. There would have been a financing gap of about, which would have equaled about 1% of the GDP of the wealthy countries. There was a report in 1970 or 1971, the Pearson report, which looked at that and said 1% is probably too high a figure. Let's lower the figure a little bit to 0.7%. So they recommended 0.7%. We're now living in a world where nobody believes in this financing gap model at all anymore. But the 0.7% figure is out there, and you will hear it reiterated at every international conference that deals with foreign assistance. There are only a very small number of countries that have actually made the 0.7%. So one thing to ask about foreign aid is, why do you get this variance where there are a few countries, actually only 4 or 5, that have actually exceeded the 0.7% figure, and many countries which actually give a much smaller percentage of their GDP. The United States, Japan are actually down near the bottom. It's about 0.20% of GDP is foreign assistance. There are some countries like Greece which are even lower. So one question is, how would we explain this variance across the wealthy countries? Why does Norway, which is granted a very wealthy country, give almost 1% of its GDP, whereas the United States gives 1/5 of 1% of GDP? The most obvious explanation, and very consistent with the evidence that we have, is that it absolutely reflects the role of the state in the domestic economy of the donor countries. So social democratic countries, where the government spends a lot of money as a share of GDP, and where there's a lot of confidence in some ways that the state can actually do something, give relatively higher amounts of foreign aid as a percentage of their GDP. In countries like the United States, maybe you would say especially the United States, where there's tremendous cynicism and skepticism about the role of the government, not only does the government spend less in the U.S., so it's around 0.3, 30% of GDP, as opposed to going up to something like 50% of the GDP for some of the social democratic countries. Not only does the government spend much less, but the fact that it spends much less reflects a lot of skepticism in the United States about the role that the government can play. And I think that's the simplest explanation for why you get this variation across states in the amount of foreign assistance that they give. So this chart, which I hope is something that you can read, I couldn't get something that was more up to date that I could figure out how to put on a slide. But I did look at the 2012 figures for donations, and they're pretty much the same. I'm sure a more adept PowerPoint person would have been able to figure this out, but I failed. But I did double check to make sure these were still valid. So you can see the countries with the green lines. These are all these small European social democratic countries. They give a relatively large amount of foreign assistance. They're the only ones that are above the 0.7% percent target figure. And a lot of other countries are relatively low. You can see the United States is down there at about 0.2. Korea is even lower. Japan, which also has a very low government expenditure to GDP ratio, is pretty low as well. So there's been a lot of, you'll see in many, many international conferences, pledges to increase the amount of assistance that countries are giving. But you can see the countries that are basically way up there in terms of foreign assistance to these countries that basically have a lot of confidence that the state itself could be efficacious. So at least on one side, of the donor side of the story, we actually have some decent understanding, I would say, of what's happening in foreign assistance. The harder thing is to understand what's happening on the other side. So how do we think about, whether or not this enterprise, which has now been going on for 60 years, how do we think about its level of success, how we understand what it's accomplished? And the striking thing, I think this is a fair statement, if foreign aid had been a business, it would have gone bankrupt 30 or 40 years ago. Because the returns look very, very sketchy if we look over this long history of foreign assistance. So very few countries have actually graduated from foreign assistance, maybe only Korea and Greece. In Korea is certainly the striking example here. So Korea in the 1950s, at the end of the Korean War, its per capita income was lower than the average per capita income in West Africa. Korea per capita income now is in the low 20s, I think, 22, 25,000 per capita. Korea's been a stunning success in terms of its rate of economic growth. But what's striking is that Korea is the only country that's really gone from being poor to gone from being very rich, and also one of the very, very few countries which is kind of, if you look at its upward curve, has shot by a large number of other countries. So if you look at economic growth in general over the last, especially over the last 20 years, countries have all grown. Latin America's grown, Africa's grown, but the sort of rank order has pretty much been the same. There have been exceptions. China is obviously an exception, although its per capita income is nowhere near Korea. But Korea, just as a country to think about, has become rich, and it also really skipped all these other countries and broke its rank order. It would have been near the bottom at the beginning, and now it's near the top. And if you look at most other countries, if you look at Brazil or many, many other countries, they have definitely become richer and more prosperous, but their rank order has remained pretty much the same in the international ranking. Korea has done great, really great. But it is an exceptional story, and there are very few other stories like that. I mean, you might point to Singapore, you might point to Taiwan, very small number of other stories. And Greece, I mean, which doesn't get foreign assistance anymore, now it's sort of maybe getting foreign assistance again. You know, I mean, it's a story where, you know, it was kind of a mess in the late 1940s, and, you know, in 2013, it's still kind of a mess. You know, hasn't changed that much, but Korea is really, really different. So very few countries that have really graduated off of foreign assistance. One piece of evidence that this doesn't look like a program that's really worked very effectively. Africa's received lots of money. This figure's a few years old, $568 billion over 42 years. Per capita economic growth rate in Africa for a long period of time was basically zero. So lots of money has flowed. It's simply not clear that you could see much in the way of results. There was a big movement after 2000 for debt forgiveness. There were a large number of developing countries which were very, very heavily in debt. It's not clear that debt forgiveness has had any correlation with higher rates of growth. There have been a number of recent statistical studies of the relationship between aid and economic growth. And what you get are, you know, this Collier's study finds a modest relationship between aid and growth of about 1%, looking primarily at Africa. Other studies have found no relationship. Other studies have actually found a negative relationship between economic growth and foreign assistance. So whatever you can say here, this is a pretty kind of dicey, unclear relationship. If you're looking at economic growth as your dependent variable. Now, I will say, I mean, if you look at some other kinds of indicators, so I would say indicators of health, there are foreign assistance programs that have been dramatically successful. So eradication of smallpox was a very amazing accomplishment. Carried out basically by the World Health Organization over an extended period of time. Last smallpox case was, I think, in Somalia in the 1970s. If you look at increases in life expectancy around the world, another health-related indicator, there's been a big increase in life expectancy across a very wide range of countries. It was dampened by the AIDS epidemic in Africa, but still, if you look at many countries, it's very impressive. So life expectancy in Bangladesh now is about 68 years. That's pretty high, and it's an increase of 20 or 30 years over the course since the end of the Second World War. That's not all a result of foreign assistance. I mean, it's a result of some better water, somewhat better healthcare provisions in some countries, but foreign assistance played a significant role in that. And here's, I think, one way of thinking about these successes and failures in foreign assistance. I think there are some tasks in foreign assistance, and immunization is the easiest one to think about, which are relatively simple. They require, in the extreme, one intervention one time. So if you can give someone one smallpox vaccination, you know, around the world, and you can do that for everybody, you can actually eliminate smallpox. There are other interventions, like promoting higher levels of economic growth, which are far, far more complex. You know, if you have rapid and disruptive economic growth in a country, it will not only change the distribution of wealth, but it will also change the distribution of political power. You know, when I was talking at the beginning of, you know, your session here, you know, the growth of Silicon Valley, you know, means that someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who's the head of Facebook, who's 28 years old or whatever he is, has many billions of dollars, can play a major role in this current debate about American immigration policy. That is a disruptive political event. And economic growth in general, if you do have rapid economic growth, is something that's very hard for existing political elites to manage. It's way more complicated than relatively simple health interventions. So I think what's fair to say about foreign assistance is it's actually improved the material well-being, especially health, for many millions, billions of people around the world. But if you look at more complicated tasks, not an immunization, or even something like the treatment of TB, which is more complicated because it requires multiple interventions, or HIV, even those more complicated health interventions are much easier to accomplish than this kind of big idea of foreign assistance that you would be able to transform levels of economic growth and also, coincidentally, transform political structures in states around the world. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, and then we can talk about some of these other things. Thoughts about this? Observations? You guys have had lots of experience. And my experience in government was when I was traveling, whenever I went to see an AID project, it always pretty much made sense. I remember going to a project in Guatemala where AID had engaged in a project which allowed farmers to produce lettuce much more effectively for the market. They had better packaging, the lettuce could last longer, and it clearly worked in terms of that individual project. But the thing you always asked was, what has this meant for Guatemala as a whole? And the answer was always not that much. So their individual projects, they're pretty good, often pretty good, they often make sense, and yet their impact on economic growth writ large doesn't look like it's very consequential. So, you guys have had lots of more experience than I have on the receiving end, so thoughts, comments?
Just what do you think was the secret for South Korea? Like, it was foreign assistance, but also maybe some political assistance as well. How would you describe this?
There's a big debate about Korea. So I can tell you the things that people point to because I'm no Korea expert. One argument, although quite debated, is the impact of the Japanese occupation. So the Japanese occupied Korea from about 1906, 08, 05 till the end of the Second World War. One argument is that they introduced bureaucratic practices in South Korea and land reform in South Korea that was very consequential. So that's one argument, and actually provided a basis for economic development which wasn't present in other countries. Similar argument is made about Taiwan. So argument number one. Argument number two is that the Korean War was very devastating for South Korea, but that South Korea really did get very substantial amounts of foreign assistance, from the United States and other countries. So there were very large capital inflows into South Korea, larger than most other recipient countries. That's argument number two. Argument number three, you could add them up, and I don't know, I don't really understand. I don't want to claim that I understand what happened in South Korea. Argument number three would be this argument about external threat. So for most countries, the idea that you could be overrun in the contemporary world, it's no longer true. Countries don't get invaded anymore. They don't get conquered. Almost no country has died. As I said, South Vietnam was the country I was thinking about since 1945. But in the Korean Peninsula, there really was an existential threat of invasion. So it was in the interest of South Korea to develop an efficient economy, one that would contribute to the defense of the country. But it's also clear what happened in South Korea, as Frank argued, is that you have a sequence in South Korea where you have the development of a strong and effective state. It is a military dictatorship. But it is a strong and effective state, and the roots of that may be in Japanese colonialism, or maybe even in a Confucian Mandarinate bureaucracy, which was a longer tradition, which then promotes economic growth, Now, it's also true the United States supports this promotion of economic growth. So Korea is develops itself as basically an export-oriented economy. The United States, if you still go to Korea, almost all the cars are Korean cars. So it's not that the United States has beat open the gates of the South Korean economy in terms of admitting imports. But they do develop an effective strategy, which is that you have to be competitive on the international market. The government takes some smart bets on industries that it's supporting. There is a lot of foreign assistance. You do have the development of a larger middle class. And you then have the military willing to give up power. And that transformatory event, if you're really willing to go from, you could say, where Korea was in the late 1980s under military dictatorship, which was in many ways following a set of technologies that had been developed in the West initially, to where it is now, where they're on the front edge of a lot of, a number of technologies, computers, flat screen TVs, what have you, did require a transformation into a democratic regime. Now, I think one of, for me at least, a question mark is why was the military willing to give up power? So the first elected president of Korea was President No Tae-woo, I think was his name. He was a former general. He was elected president in the late 1980s. His son was actually a student at Stanford, so I remember this was one of my sort of the high points of my career. I and one of my colleagues actually were invited to Korea, got to eat in the Blue House, which is the president's mansion. But at the end of his term, this guy ended up in jail for corruption, which is not an infrequent development in Korea. Most Korean presidents have either been prosecuted or committed suicide. It's a very tough political environment. But so it wasn't obvious why would the military, which was running the country, have agreed to give up political power? And I think that, and in something that ended up being quite precarious, because this guy did end up in jail afterwards. It wasn't that he guaranteed his position, not even in the way that Pinochet did in Chile. And the only thing I can add, I'm thinking about Egypt and Pakistan as contrasts. The military was not involved in the economy in the same way that is true in Egypt and Pakistan. So the economy is run by these chaebol. These are large conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai, in which the family members are still running these organizations. But the military wasn't directly involved. But still, I want to say big question mark there about, why did the military doesn't always do this, and they did do it in Korea, and it was costly for them. They paid these individual guys paid a cost. And that's a piece of the story that I just don't understand well. I think other people might have, I don't know whether anyone else in the room has thoughts about that, but that's not clear to me.
Okay. Just a few comments, because development has been my career for several years. I think there is one other aspect also which I just want to point to, that when the foreign assistance started, then there was one aspect of giving opportunity to internal trade organizations or other organizations to do business, even though this was not a trading contract. For example, all the travel will be then funded by the country's airlines, and all the procurement will be done by the country's, not the receiving country, but the giving country's company. So that element, I think, is very important, because a lot of times people don't understand in the receiving country why we cannot go for the lowest quotation. Right. And the resistance that over the years, for example, with the USAID mechanism, when for the first time it was said that local country organizations can actually bid, and there was a lot of resistance. Then there was a backing off of that decision, saying, okay, the front runner would be that. Then there was more backing off, saying, okay, up to 30%. Then I think now there is more backing off from that, saying, you try to get up to 30% of the local countries. So that shows how much domestic pressure the developed countries have to use that part of money for their own business also. That aspect. And the other, I just wanted to reinforce from the receiving end, reinforce what you said about conceiving and the vision of these things, because I have seen more of these aid projects to fail rather than succeed. And also, just to kind of zoom in and say that the approach that development assistance has direct impact on the success of the project. The big projects and those that have big bureaucracies behind them, they tend to lose out on what the main mission is. And small fundings and more flexible fundings that some organizations have here, and I would specifically refer to NED, National Endowment for Democracy, as an example, they tend to hit the target better because they're more in tune with the local movement of the change, and they're not these huge $1 million pots that kind of destroy the local grain of the movement, social change.
Right.
So just comments.
So let me just, I mean, if I could follow up. So I've kind of told a pretty pessimistic story here about foreign aid. I mean, there is another story which would follow in what you said, which is that the reason foreign aid has not worked very well is because it really didn't, it said it was doing something, but it really didn't do it. So certainly it's true, if you look at American foreign assistance during the Cold War, the United States, I mean, clearly gave a lot of money to autocratic regimes that were non-communist. And they didn't give the money because they thought that these regimes were going to actually develop their countries effectively. They gave them money because they were autocratic political leaders who would ally with the United States rather than ally with the Soviet Union. So you could say at that point, well, we were giving foreign assistance, but really it was just security assistance. So that's one point. And a second point, and the one that you've made, when you look about procurement rules and what have you. So especially in the United States, I think where there's not much commitment to kind of foreign aid in general, I think there's political commitment to specific programs like PEPFAR and HIV or health for mothers and children, but not foreign assistance kind of economic development in the abstract. You were always constrained by domestic politics. So you had to buy American grain to give food aid, completely inefficient and screwed up. You know, or you had to have these procurement in which you were trying to maintain a base of political support in the United States for foreign assistance by buying stuff from Americans as opposed to buying it from the least expensive source. So defenders of foreign aid, I mean, would paint a more optimistic picture. They would say, look, to me, you know, look, you're criticizing foreign aid for not being very successful. But in fact, most foreign aid, for most of foreign aid's history, you know, wasn't actually directed at promoting economic development. It was at, you know, promoting security or making sure that American farmers, I mean, got higher revenues by having them participate in international food programs. So that would be a defense. Look, I think there's some merit to this. I still think foreign aid for accomplishing complicated things is extremely hard. And then I'm going to come back to your last point later in this talk about, you know, can we, you know, the big programs versus the small programs, the opportunistic on the ground with a lot of knowledge versus kind of the large programs which are working with more limited knowledge of local environments and using kind of more universalistic rules. That's been a big debate in the aid community. You know, with some people very much advocating smaller programs and some people advocating larger programs.
I want to ask a question. I think, in my view, I think development is not merely restricted to growth or economic development. It is a much comprehensive concept and have a lot of indicators. So I was wondering, like, is there any statistical studies, like, not only view the growth as an own indicator to evaluate the success of development, say, if there is a comprehensive one like equality, good governance, and other indicators to judge the...
Yeah, so there are, there may be more than I know about. There are studies of the relationship between democracy assistance and democratization. And the basic finding is, if you actually have foreign assistance that's targeted to democracy assistance, and, this is the important and you have actors in the recipient countries that are also committed to these objectives, you do get a positive correlation. These correlations are all pretty weak. You know, they're not like great. So again, I mean, there is some evidence that if you can target and this is the big and, you actually have recipients that care about these things, that foreign assistance might be effective if you're looking at democratization. The studies of human rights, which is another area, I don't know of direct studies that look at foreign assistance and the promotion of human rights, but there is an excellent book by Beth Simmons, someone who teaches at Harvard, about the impact of international human rights agreements and human rights practices in countries. The basic findings are these. Zero correlation between signing an international human rights treaty and human rights practices within a country. Means nothing. Lots of autocratic repressive regimes sign human rights agreements, has no impact on what they're actually doing. There is a correlation, though, a relationship between signing a human rights agreement and countries that are transitioning to democracy. And the argument that Simmons makes is this. In transitioning countries, signing a human rights agreement changes your domestic politics and your domestic laws. So it does two things in particular. One is it helps people within the country to organize because they know what they're organizing. There's a salient thing to organize about. You sign a human rights agreement, say, about the rights of the child. People may organize around the rights of the child, whereas before they didn't think children had any rights at all. And secondly, signing the agreement, signing an international agreement, will actually change domestic law so that when cases are brought to court, it may actually make some difference. But I think the general conclusion and a way to think about this, which I think is correct, is that these international pressures, if we're thinking about human rights, democratization, governance, it's only going to work if there are actors in the target state that have an incentive to make it work. And if they don't, it will be subverted. You can give them money, it's not going to make any difference. So there has to be a deal. There has to be some kind of, I would say, contract between the donors and some actors in the recipient countries that will actually lead this to have some effect. And if you don't have the right conditions in the recipient countries, you're not going to get a positive outcome. And, you know, if I could add, just even if you're thinking about simple things like health, if you look at the dispute about polio immunization in Pakistan, something that also happened in northern Nigeria in 2004 and 2005, same, in northern Nigeria, there was opposition from both Islamic clerics and political leaders to the polio immunization program. The program was actually halted in northern Nigeria. There was a lot of work to change the views of these domestic political actors, but by the time the program was reinstated, the absence of immunization had resulted in 500,000 polio cases. So even something relatively simple, if it doesn't have domestic political support, I think it's not going to work.
Thank you. I think that you are going to address later on the difference in between the results on aid that it comes from very small or like independent or private organizations in comparison with the big efforts that governments are doing. So that is easily seen, for example, in Colombia, when you have this huge amount of money that for years have been addressing different issues on conflict. For example, USAID has had a major just a major proposal in Colombia with very different topics during many years. But when you see the real impact, you see a higher impact donors that are not going through the state, the Colombian state itself, and also with those that work more with the local, directly with the local communities. Because sometimes what happened, I once I read a document, I can't find it anymore, but it was addressing the proportion of $1 that donors gives to the country, and how many cents of that dollar actually goes to the communities, and it's very little, because then these are huge organizations that have a higher cost. But then I think that you're going to address it later, so I won't comment more about that. But then I was reading about this Act, the Foreign Act Transparency and Accountability, the Foreign Transparency and Accountability Act that you are in the States studying in Congress. And I really would like to know if that is an intention on really evaluate the impact of the aid that the United States has done, and if it has like some hidden idea on trying to get the information needed to cut off like a huge part of that aid that the States is giving to the world. Because when you read the document on the act, you see that is mostly focusing which are the results of most of that aid. But then I don't know if you can comment maybe which could be the results or the impact of that specific act in the money that our countries receive from the States aid.
Okay, so I don't know enough about the Foreign Transparency and Accountability Act. And I could bluff, but I don't want to do it because you guys are too smart and you catch me. I think on this other issue, I think we will have time to get back to this, but you can see the pluses and minuses on both sides of the kind of big centralized programs versus smaller programs. So it may be that you can identify a smaller program working directly with recipients that looks like it's consequential. The question then would be, and the critique of that would be, yes, but aren't you undermining, in the end, don't you need an effective state in Colombia or whatever the other country is? Aren't you undermining the state by having all of these smaller, uncoordinated programs? Will they actually add up to something? So, I mean, I'll give you an example because you certainly see a lot of that here. So, this is a program, I know about this indirectly because the daughter of a friend of mine is working for it. So, but you hear about this, like this is the kind of thing that bumps around this area, Stanford and Silicon Valley. So, this is a woman who was in the Peace Corps, I believe it was Senegal in the 1970s. She's now a lawyer in Silicon Valley. She's made a lot of money. She wants to do something for this town where she was stationed in the Peace Corps. So she's providing them with resources so that they can set up a computer center in the town. Now, it sounds nice. You know, the question is, I mean, will this work? It's not coordinated with anything else. They're kind of operating out there on their own. And here I think I'm going to hint at what I'm going to say later is there is a real question about how you think development takes place. If you think it's kind of haphazard, unpredictable, you just want to plant a bunch of seeds. You don't know which of the seeds will grow. You have to keep your fingers crossed. It may rain, it may not rain. Then you would be very supportive of these smaller programs. And we'll come later to talk about William Easterly has kind of been a big advocate of this. If you think that, if you believe in modernization theory or even thinking about institutional capacity as a way that things work in terms of development writ large, then, I mean, you have to think about bigger programs. You know, you would say then there really is a capital gap in some industries. We really do need a minimal level of government competence if we're going to get development. So when you think about the smaller disaggregated programs, in some ways you're really kind of buying into this kind of development as a complicated process that's very haphazard, depends on luck, And you want to sort of plant a lot of seeds with the hope that something will sprout, but you may never really know you will never know how it's going to turn out ahead of time. As opposed to thinking about modernization theory or institutional capacity, where you'd put much more focus on bigger centralized programs. So there's a kind of, the sort of aid programs that I think you're sympathetic to, I mean, and they're not mutually exclusive, partly depends upon how you think about this process, this process working in general, I think. Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to have a quick comment about the inefficiency of aid that is coming to our countries. I think this is it is mostly related to the local capacity to absorb this aid. I think also that we are unable to enforce quality of the aid coming.
I didn't hear the second part.
We are unable to enforce the quality of aid that is coming to our countries.
So I think,
And the lack of local capacity to absorb and to demand quality aid.
right. So I think they're really, I think both of these points are correct. But I think the first one, the question on the first one is this. Is it a question of capacity or is it a question of interest in the recipient countries? Now, they're not unrelated. But my view is I think it's thinking of the ability to use aid simply in terms of capacity, as if it were just a technical problem, seems to me to miss the fact that what you need local political elites or local elites that want this aid and believe in it and are committed to it. So in the extreme, I mean, this northern Nigeria example, or now the Pakistan example of polio immunizations, the local elite, not a trivial part of it, people that have guns and are willing to shoot people as opposed to this, it makes it very hard to work. There are also going to be countries, I mean, I would say that have a fair amount of capacity, but don't have an interest in using aid effectively. I give you, for me, I mean, an example. I mean, it's not quite an aid example. Azerbaijan. There are a lot of competent people I would say, in the Azeri bureaucracy. Azerbaijan, now this was not an aid program, but they signed up to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is designed to reduce corruption. I would say in Azerbaijan, it made no difference whatsoever. They weren't really interested in reducing corruption. That's not what the political elite was interested in. They were interested in appearing to reduce corruption so they would look better in the international community. And there, I think it's really a question. I think the term political will is a very bad term because it's sort of meaningless, but political interest, there has to be, I think, a political interest for the elite, whether in the government or outside of the government, to want to work with external donors. And if that interest isn't there, I think it's very hard for an aid program to be effective. So I don't know how much it's just, I'm skeptical about the technical capacity as opposed to, whether or not the interests of the external and internal actors are really coincident.